Hello and welcome to Connect and Collaborate. I'm Alex Hopkins, your on-air producer, and I am super pumped for today's show. But before I do that, I have to ask our audience a few favors. Please visit cobrt.com. Sign up for our newsletter while you're there. Click on the media tab. You can see past productions that we've done, as well as all of our radio shows live on that page as well. Check out our events page so you can sign up for our future events. And then when you're done with that, go to our YouTube page, like and subscribe there as well. So let's get today's show started. I am very excited. So I have a returning guest, Chris Schmidt. He is the managing partner at Denver for Deloitte. How are you doing, Chris?
Good. How about you, Alex?
Wonderful.
Great to be back.
Yes, so happy to have you. And today you brought a wonderful guest with you. This is Linda Pawczuk. She is the principal U.S. blockchain leader at Deloitte. How are you doing?
Yeah, terrific. Thank you for having me.
Yes, wonderful. And I also have a pretty recognizable character here, Keenan Brugh. He is with ICOSA Media and my local blockchain expert, the guy that I go to when I read things and I don't understand it. So,
well, thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be learning from you both here today.
Yeah. Super exciting stuff. So blockchain, I feel like might be considered a buzzword, but it's been around for quite a while, as I just learned on the break here, from Linda, actually. And so exciting stuff. What I'm going to have us do, though, is have you guys give a little bit of an intro and background about yourselves so that our audience is reminded, one, about you, Chris,
Sure.
and is going to meet you today, Linda. So Chris, if you don't mind, just giving a little intro about yourself.
Absolutely. So I'm the managing partner for Deloitte here in Denver. So I'm responsible for the 1,550 folks we have in Colorado across our 4 offices and our 4 businesses of audit, tax, financial advisory, and consulting. Grew up in Colorado, attended school here, college at CSU, grad school at CU. Recently back from a small stint in Florida with the firm, so excited to be here and excited to be back with you again today.
Yes, absolutely. Well, we appreciate the refresher on your background
Absolutely.
there. Yes. And Linda, tell me a little bit about yourself. If you want to start with schooling and how you ended up at Deloitte, tell me more about you.
Sure. So my experience at Deloitte has just been tremendous. I've joined the firm 11 years ago, but I'm a veteran of 34 years working in technology, including some early days in Silicon Valley, which is the real sentiments of entrepreneurship. I lead now both our global and U.S. practice for blockchain, which has been a real fascinating experience. We have over 1,400 people globally who are addressing the innovation opportunities associated with both large enterprise and a significant number of those that are what we would characterize as emerging disruptors. The startups who are really putting a footprint and fingerprint on the value and native blockchain, if we could call it that.
Native blockchain, I like that. I'm going to have lots of new terminology after today's show, I'm sure of that. And Keenan, just a little refresher. It's been a while since you've been on the show with us.
Yeah, it has been a little bit. I'm usually on the other side of the camera, though I got a special invite here today from Alex because of my enthusiasm and interest in continually learning about the blockchain space. As a tech geek, I'm always looking at various things, and blockchain's one of those protocol type levels that's getting more and more awareness, even on the executive level, and I'm sure a lot of your clients. And so I'm constantly trying to learn, and so I'm looking forward to today's show to see what executives are asking, what they're looking for, how the technology is continuing to evolve. So thanks for having me here today.
Yeah, absolutely. So Linda, I'm going to start here with you on a very basic level. What is blockchain and what is the value of using blockchain?
Sure. Let me start first with an assertion, though, in terms of why something like blockchain. Because we could spend a lot of time, much like if we were to talk about the internet, the 13 nodes of the original setup of the internet, and I think that would probably bore most of the listeners. The reality is, though, let me assert something around data. Enterprises, big and small, are swimming in data. And the data that's being produced, it's being produced not only from traditional systems, whether it's an accounts payable system at the most foundational level, but the reality is more and more structured and unstructured data, which is data like text information, as well as new innovation like AI or the streaming data that is pouring in from sensor-based information in IoT. The reality is enterprises big and small continue to be challenged with the reconciliation, the settlement, the transfer, the trading partner information associated with data. So if we simplify and we try to mitigate what has been billions of dollars each year spent by enterprises, again, big and small, that are trying to simplify the complexity of data. Many of them feel like it's not only a challenge around collection, but the data that they have is beginning to collapse around them. So how do you deal with what is and will continue to be, including with, particularly in our city here, the advent of 5G? What is that going to mean? So here we are as a society, not just locally, but globally, dealing with vast amounts of information. Some of the information that exists there is not necessarily competitive. It's just data that causes a lot of friction around your trading partners, exchanging information. And what if we could simplify that? Instead of writing data multiple times in multiple systems, what if we wrote the data once? What if the multiple writers of the data was simplified to the exchange of the same information, particularly around things that are non-competitive? Is it really competitive data when we look at things like an accounts payable system and you issue an invoice and it becomes a payable on my side and then I submit a payment for settlement? Is that really competitive? No, that's just really basic exchange of value. So we refer to blockchain as the transfer of value. And we can talk about those examples. At the simplest form, and if I were to bring this to life, what breathed life into blockchain is now about 10 years ago. In January of 2009, the world was either charmed by or insulted by this thing called Bitcoin, which was the first form of cryptocurrency. And what cryptocurrency was, as the first use case, was an opportunity to exchange value, in this case a crypto coin, exchange value between two entities in a peer-to-peer network, essentially eliminating the need for the intermediary. So if you think in the simplest form, without getting into a whole lot of detail, which I can in a moment, talk about the fundamentals of the technology, it is a peer-to-peer infrastructure that allows for the exchange of value. A value could be a deed from a house. Value could be cryptocurrency. Value could be the exchange of information such as the provenance or association of something like a diamond. What's the origin of that diamond or the certification of the diamond? Or it could be something like a person's identity, right?
Okay. I'm following. I'm learning today. I love this. It's awesome. So I love that you gave me some tangible ways of how it can be used. But you mentioned that technology has been around for decades, right? And that Bitcoin, its first use was only 10 years ago. What are we learning about how companies are adopting blockchain? Because I know that we see a lot of push and pull. Some companies are on board immediately. Some companies are way hesitant on it.
Sure. So the first thing is again, let's harken back to the internet era. When we go back in time, and as I mentioned, the technologies have existed for decades. For instance, cryptography was founded in the 70s and 80s for mobile exchange. Peer-to-peer networks. Can you guess the first peer-to-peer network? That would be Napster. Right?
Oh, wow.
The exchange of information through, and there's no intermediary there. And then, of course, you have basically public key encryption, which the whole innovation around public key was untrusted parties needing to exchange information. And so you had the function of encryption. So these technologies have existed for years. But if I go back to the 90s, and as I think about blockchain and innovation, we're still at a very rudimentary phase. Right? We're not at the mature state. There's things that we did during the internet era in the 90s that have since been cast to the shore. And in this case, with the future of what the internet's become some decades later, look where we're at. Same thing with blockchain. So Bitcoin in 2009 launching, and what we're seeing as companies, it has been a bit of slow adoption. We see early pioneers who experiment around the application of how this infrastructure could work. We're seeing sensible changes around the infrastructure itself, where it's settling into more common standards and protocols. But the use cases have become sensible too. Always early in innovation, whether it was the internet era in the 90s versus now, always you're going to see a lot of use cases pouring into the marketplace, and some of them not sensible. So by way of example, let me give you an example associated with something that's pretty important. When we look at the origin of food production, everything from the farm to the table, there's a whole number of steps that go that are in play associated with the growth and the production of that produce or product, all the way to getting it to the distribution point and then getting it to the table. But what's the traceability associated with that? And we call this use case track and trace. So for food safety related reasons, particularly on produce, particularly as we've seen food recalls around the safety just recently last fall around romaine lettuce, is what's the origin of that product? Well, if you have hundreds and hundreds of farmers producing that product, and how do you trace what is the exact farm location that has perhaps a problem associated with the safety of that food? So instead, what happens with the food retail system is they must destroy all produce. What if we could isolate it down because we know through a serialization process the origin of that food? And so there's something called food track and trace. So that would be an example where you could see a product in its life cycle, which could deposit the information, the data being stored, and the transfer of that information onto the blockchain so that you could isolate down to something much more precise versus the destruction of all the produce in the market, which for food retailers ends up in the billions and billions of dollars because of, in this case, you must apply to the regulations and the safety associated with that. So that would be one example of something that sits on a blockchain even today and is used in the marketplace today.
As a follow-up question for that, can you describe how something like blockchain offers a better value for that type of track and trace service than just a database of old? Is it because of the multiple parties being involved? Is it because of standards and regulations and specific trackability? Just some of the differences between old school databases and now blockchain.
Yeah, terrific question. One of the criteria for blockchain, because not everything is a blockchain use case. In fact, we try to guide clients safely to the landing zone of not wasting time creating solutions that could just simply be solved with existing database technology. But to that end, some of the criteria that you look at is, in fact, multiple writers of the same data. And you look at also multi-party types of events where you're having an ecosystem of participants that could join together around the same or common information.
Awesome. And so I may be off base here, but if you're looking across industries and you have one company that is on the blockchain bandwagon, but one company that is not, do you run into issues with exchanging that information?
So it really is, there's a category that we characterize because of multi-party called the consortium-based model. So the consortium-based model is an important part of the ecosystem where many parties opt in to participating. You often find at the beginning around setting up a use case that one of the best ways to start to work together to orchestrate the governance in a consortium-based model is it's different than traditional enterprise governance, because now it's party-to-party type governance, is we look for use cases that are simple, not competitive, high friction, right? Things that would not create compromise as you start to test out the consortium model of the multiple parties. Another way you would develop a new use case in that multi-party consortium model is things that are highly regulated. By way of example, we're working on a very fascinating set of use cases that actually cross the healthcare system as well as the pharmaceutical and as well as the pharmacy, that is the distributor. We're looking for creating a solution that is creating drug transparency around price, as well as providing a better ecosystem amongst the players, literally from the point of diagnosis to the distribution point of the drug. It's a very important use case, and it does involve what you would call as a horizontal consortium. The horizontal consortium includes many different industry players, whether it's the payer-provider side in the healthcare system, whether it's the actual pharmaceutical company that is the inventor and distributor of the drug, and then to the distribution point, which would be the pharmacy or the therapy center. And so there's a tremendous opportunity where even if you aren't playing per se, over time you may opt into that consortium-based model.
Ooh, cool. I like that. You mentioned that you lead both the global and the U.S. For Deloitte. markets as far as blockchain is concerned. Again, blockchain, from what I'm understanding and learning here today, is that it's kind of a universal language, right? That being said, what kind of trends do you see in global versus U.S. when it comes to blockchain? Or are there differences?
There are differences, and this is the amazing opportunity that we harness as a firm, because it's not only global, but it's multifaceted, and I'll talk about that in a second. But what we're learning is in places like Europe, there are certain countries that are crypto friendly. They're building and creating regulations and laws that allow you to exchange the digital asset around cryptocurrency. And so where we have countries such as Malta, such as Switzerland, that are very, driving legislation to more digital adoption, we learn a lot from that. We learn a lot from things that are also happening, for instance, around trade finance, which we know on a global basis there are trillions of dollars moving across the earth associated with the shipment of goods or services and products. And as a result of that, some of the more advanced countries, in this case the Asia-Pac region, and it's now migrating into Europe, is we're learning from the legislation, the regulations, and the use cases associated with that adoption. So the fact that we work as an ecosystem across the globe, and as we know certainly in the category of things like transportation and logistics, even in the automotive industry, things are moving from the European continent to America, and these are components that need to get to the right point in time for building of that vehicle. So we are able to use a lot. In fact, I'm a member of a very unique function within the World Economic Forum. They call it the Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution. I'm a council member with the World Economic Forum, of which we're working truly across the globe with participants, numerous participants. In fact, we have a council meeting next week to discuss how do we start to develop and grow the use and the adoption associated with blockchain. Now, let me say one more thing, and that's, I mentioned to you, multifaceted. Many experiments associated with blockchain today is companies are focused too much on the technology. I often say to clients that I meet or in speaking engagements is that's the wrong place to start. In fact, I would venture to say that if you start with technology purely, you won't have a very successful outing. The reality is blockchain is about inventing new business models, and it's about looking at processes and controls and risk and regulatory associated with the business models. The technology itself will come. But most of the time, in terms of the things that we're building or doing globally, we spend probably 80% of our time focused on consortium governance, focused on what is the process and the models of process to change. But moreover, and this is the multifaceted part that's just a tremendous asset to Deloitte, is there's audit structure. Do we know how to audit digital assets? We use our tax team. Our tax team has 300 people throughout the globe thinking about what are the tax implications, both indirect and direct tax, associated with the movement of a digital currency or the movement of information through what's another key word here, token-based business models. So we benefit from not just being a global consulting firm, the world's largest professional services firm, but we bring everything to the table when we're talking with clients around the movement towards this digital asset type of construct and the value exchange through blockchain.
Awesome. I have a quick question, and you may not be able to answer this, but with every new technology, which is great and innovative and lovely to hear, there's always a little bit of con, right? Inevitably. One of the things that I have talked about previously, and you mentioned governances, particularly in Europe, being able to pass laws and legislation around this. One of the things that I've talked about with the Department of Regulatory Agencies here in Colorado is a little bit of fraud. There's somebody that's going to ask you to invest in their Bitcoin, their blockchain. I know that there's different cryptocurrencies, right? So there is this, you might fall into a little bit of fraud. Somebody may ask you for investment that isn't right. How can you speak to that? I imagine most companies that you work with already have a team looking out for any fraud that they can fall into. But do you have any advice on combating that? Any things to look out for?
Sure. Well, I certainly can't offer legal advice.
Right. Yes.
However, what I will say is this. You're absolutely right. In the early days of Bitcoin, and that is where it has gotten a bit of a tarnished name, is there was a tremendous amount of nefarious activity. What we advise, and in working with some very prominent legal firms, is when we look at the legal structure of your entity, what is the thing you're creating and what is that thing going to do? In the center of all of this, the most important thing that must be examined before you even proceed with developing upon this business model, particularly if there's value exchanged, is what we call your AML program, which is your anti-money laundering program, and your KYC, which is known as Know Your Customer. AML and KYC of those companies that are doing right things in the market, that is at the center of deciding and determining what the path forward of the company is. We meet with a lot of startups, and we see this less in the enterprise side, but in the startup side is they really aren't even familiar with AML KYC programs. You must, by virtue of regulation and in terms of the SEC, you must understand the AML KYC program. So that helps to prevent the potential of fraud happening. Now, on the actual blockchain itself, when we think about fraud, you may have read articles in the past where, perhaps someone's cryptocurrency was hijacked, right? As a result of that, it wasn't what was necessarily a cyber attack wasn't on the blockchain itself. It was actually on the digital wallet that hosts the coins associated with that individual's, ownership. And so there's a layer in terms of just you would think of in a physical world is the Bitcoin has to be deposited somewhere, and that digital wallet can be compromised if not necessarily built proper or in fact joined up with the right exchanges or the right companies that do understand what they're doing to create the protections.
Awesome. Thank you. I appreciate, and again, I know you can't give any legal advice, but I wanted to, because as we know, good and bad, right, with every new technology. So I appreciate you diving into that with me.
Well, and what's interesting about what you just said is some of the practices that people need to pay attention to around blockchain are not necessarily new things. I mean, you think about, the largest company that's headquartered here in Denver that, deals in money transferring, not necessarily blockchain, but knowing their customers and anti-money laundering is a huge thing for them. And it's not necessarily blockchain. It's, some of the same things that you had to pay attention to with, the older ways of transferring assets and money are, not any different than when you deal with blockchain, right?
That's exactly right, Chris.
Awesome. I just want to ask real quick in the last couple minutes here. You mentioned digital wallet. Again, new term for me. I assume it's a new term for some of our viewers as well. Do you mind explaining exactly what the digital wallet is in comparison to cryptocurrency or blockchain? Sure.
Well, when we transfer digital assets, they in fact remain digital, and so there is not a physical property associated with this. So if we consider this a digital wallet, it's basically I would simplify it as an enveloping of the digital asset in a secure way, so that you have the ability as the owner of the digital wallet to be able to transfer, in this case, crypto assets or digital assets in and out of that wallet.
Awesome. I always appreciate the explanation there. Fascinating conversation. In this last minute, I want to know where I can find more about your blockchain information at Deloitte.
Sure. In fact, which we can talk about perhaps in a future segment, is just May the 6th, we just released our annual survey. It's the 2019 Global Blockchain Survey. That's the Deloitte Global Blockchain Survey. And out on Deloitte.com, you will find that particular survey and the report that we released associated with that on Deloitte.com. In addition to that, if you do a keyword search on Deloitte.com for blockchain, you will find a number of materials that we've published, as well as out on the internet as well. You'll see a number of articles we published with the Wall Street Journal and other very prominent medias and publications.
Awesome. And I know that you've definitely read some of those. So,
absolutely.
When we come back, we're going to talk about local Denver and how blockchain is playing a role here locally. So we'll be right back. Stay with us here on Connect and Collaborate. Be sure to like and subscribe our YouTube page while you're here. And find this podcast more at cobrt.com/radio-podcast. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Connect and Collaborate. Once again, I am Alex Hopkins, your on-air producer, and I am having a fascinating conversation here about blockchain. Again, with Linda Pawczuk. She is from Deloitte, and her title is principal U.S. blockchain leader, which is awesome. So you are the expert, resident expert that we have here for blockchain, as well as Chris Schmidt, who is the managing partner for Denver for Deloitte. And always a pleasure to have you on, Chris. Thank you and welcome back.
Thank you.
Yes. And Keenan, Brugh, who is my blockchain guy, the one that I turn to when I don't know what I'm talking about. And if I keep hedging on investing and seeing what I can do. So I always turn to him for some advice. And he's also with ICOSA Media and typically behind the camera, but he's joining me on camera today.
Well, thanks for having me.
Yes.
And it's an opportunity here today to be able to learn from you guys at Deloitte. I mean, that's part of how I'm able to describe things to you is by finding industry leaders. And you had just mentioned at the end of the last segment the survey you guys have done. And I was able to look through it, and it was fascinating between 2018 and 2019. I'm wondering if you could share with our listeners a little bit about what you've been seeing and then some of the changes between last year and then this year's survey.
Sure, Keenan. And it is interesting because we host this survey on an annual basis. And what we're really looking to do is draw upon its executive survey. It's a global survey. In fact, this year we added Brazil to the survey, which added some additional fascinating things happening in South America as well. But we're looking for the sentiments and the disposition towards moving to the lens that Deloitte looks at blockchain, and that's adoption. We've seen trending this year that's actually quite positive. In fact, the tagline in our survey is not whether or not blockchain exists, but what can blockchain do for me? So we're seeing a movement towards a much more sensible discussion associated with blockchain. We are looking at adoption, and what was most interesting, there were 2 points in the survey that I'd like to draw out. The first, which is we continue to see it being identified north of 70% of all companies interviewed, that it is either in the top 5 priority or it's an important priority. So that over 70% of all enterprises see blockchain as a significant priority in their enterprise. The other important point is that we are starting to see some real results netted from those use cases that have now been in production and where you've got multiple parties participating, which is you're trying to drive out the return on investment and benefit. What the survey also told us is that they're seeing that in the next 2 years, not only viable, but real measurable results associated with the implementation and the use of this particular technology. So just like I said, when you look for the right type of use case, and blockchain is in fact the right technology, we are just seeing just enormous benefit. And you'll see in the rest of the survey, there's other fascinating findings, including another population we included in the survey this year are the emerging disruptors. Again, the native blockchain companies, those that are innovating new businesses and new platforms because blockchain exists.
Yes. And I also want to reiterate to our audience, check the description below. We have the link for the survey, so be sure to take that. It's valuable information that you guys use moving forward. I would like to talk, we talked on a global scale, we talked on a national scale, but one of the things we do here for the Colorado Business Roundtable is we talk about Colorado. So how are we seeing some trends here in Colorado, in Denver particularly? I know that we have some legislation that may be passed, but what are some themes that we're seeing here in Colorado as far as blockchain is concerned?
Yeah, maybe I'll start just high level, and Linda's clearly more knowledgeable on the topic than I am. But from a macro standpoint, there's a lot of growth, a lot of technology companies that are either starting here, moving here. So in the space that we kind of notionally call fintech is where most of these companies fall. You're starting to see more startups. You're starting to see more companies move here. Clearly, what Governor Hickenlooper started a couple years ago with his Colorado Council for the Advancement of Blockchain Technology has been a motivator, not only in terms of what the state government is looking to potentially do to kind of modernize some of their services, but also promoting blockchain within the state. But then I'll switch to some of the trends that we see specifically. So we host industry roundtables, most notably around oil and gas companies, CPG food companies, software technology companies, and then we have a couple others. At least what I'm seeing when we facilitate those groups is that for the vast majority of those companies, they're not doing anything actively with blockchain now, and these are all Colorado companies, I would say in the kind of 50 million to maybe below $1 billion range. They know what it is generally. They're talking about it, but as far as using it, implementing it, and having, kind of use cases for what they would do with it, not quite there yet. But I think they recognize that it's something that could either be pushed on them by large players in their industry or a consortium. So at least that's some of the things I observe and how I interact, and then I'll leave it to Linda to kind of maybe drill down a couple notches below that.
Yeah, Chris, I think that's right, particularly for the segment of the business marketplace you talk about. Let's be clear. Let's go back to business fundamentals. It's called discretionary spend. And when you're a smaller enterprise, you have less discretionary spend available to you for things like innovation. However, they're staying very clued in to what is happening with blockchain because the larger enterprises are adopting it faster, and they will be part of, as we talked earlier about, the consortium, the ecosystem of participants, whether they're upstream or downstream in a process to participate. So in Colorado, we might see fewer of the enterprises in full adoption mode or experimenting around a set of use cases, but there is a lot of interest. Two things to note there is one is through the Hickenlooper program and in the governor's office now is this continued focus around the advancement of technology. And so the Colorado Technology Association has got a very active membership associated with blockchain and the adoption of blockchain. Recently, on behalf of Deloitte and Chris' support, I had the privilege to also speak this last fall at the Denver Business Council and the Denver Chamber of Commerce in downtown, and one of our legislatures were actually there, also co-presenting, talking about some legislation that Colorado is passing as it relates to blockchain and, of course, the digital assets and cryptocurrency. And so I think Colorado is on the edge, as is progressing and charging forward. Again, without the focus of the value that can be created through the business and the uses of blockchain in and of itself, it's just another interesting technology. So also this past year, there was a terrific a program called Blockchain Week that was hosted here in Colorado. I had the chance to participate in that. And it was a lot of what I call the enterprising startup organizations that are looking at ways as to how to harness and harvest this technology as I mentioned, the native blockchain use cases. So I think Denver's doing a great job of bringing this to life and trying to make sense of where this fits into our economic ecosystem, both in public and private sector.
Awesome. We touched on this a little bit throughout, but what type of companies are investing in or are exploring blockchain? And that so far as, is there a particular set of companies that should be exploring it more?
There are numerous industries. In fact, I've yet to see an industry that hasn't touched it. Germane, though, to what's happening in Colorado, the energy industry is deep in exploration and use of blockchain. In fact, one of the most successful use cases out there on the globe is something that was implemented by some of the world's largest oil companies, companies such as ExxonMobil and Chevron and others. And it's a platform that the listeners can go look at. It's called VACT, V-A-K-T, and it basically is a blockchain use case for post-commodity settlements. So energy is deep in. Telecommunications and media. If we think about use cases in particularly in the media with royalty payments, it is a very labor and sometimes Excel spreadsheet intensive process. So royalty payments, if you imagine by way of example, you are an artist, you are going to perform at a concert at Red Rocks this summer, and suddenly all the ticket sales go out, but some of those ticket sales go to people who are selling in the aftermarket for substantially higher price. If you are the producer of that and sponsor of that particular concert, your revenue is based upon the face value of the tickets sold. So if there's a delta between a ticket that was $200 and instead sold for $800, so where does the balance of that that new value creation go? It doesn't go to the artist. It doesn't go to the producer of the show. go. And so if you start to register the ticket sales on a blockchain, even if they're trade for a higher value, then the producer or the artist can actually retrieve that. I was recently at a conference in Toronto, and one of the primary speakers was actually, in fact, a very prominent musician who is actively involved with a company in creating a blockchain use case.
That's really
Wow,
neat.
interesting.
Yeah.
Totally new idea. It's amazing how this underlying technology can be applied to so many different industries such as that. Had never even considered.
Yeah. That's awesome. Way to keep people in line. I like that.
Well, and yeah, the key really is what industries have a big problem that they're trying to solve that has a lot of manual processes, has a lot of leakage, has a lot of challenges. And it's, again, like you've said several times, and I can't emphasize it enough, it's not about the technology, like you've said, it's about what's the problem we're trying to solve, what's the thing that we potentially could shift an operating model or transform a business. That's where the key to all this comes in. It's not so much in just the implementation of a blockchain, it's how do you use it to solve a big, meaty problem? So
we start all discussions with, let's talk about the opportunity and the business problem. We don't start discussions talking about blockchain. Blockchain just happens to be a solution set that could be exploited. But the reality is, as Chris said, we're moving to an era of time where perhaps most younger generation, all financial transactions that happen from them happen with the tap of their phone. We've moved to a much more digital economy, and if you have a teenager in your house, when they ask to borrow $20 from you and you start to reach for your wallet, they put up their hand and say, no, transfer it to me via Venmo, which is a peer-to-peer process. So you can imagine that we're in the early stage, much like 1990, of what the internet did for us. Think about this as the transfer of value on the internet, and what's the potential of this market in the next several years.
So you're telling me my mattress full of money is behind the times.
What's your address?
Great segue, though, into my next question here. What kind of services does Deloitte provide, right? You know that you want to get at the heart of what the issue is, which is, you guys do a great job at figuring that out for companies. But what exactly are your services that are entailed?
Our services, as I mentioned earlier, is this multifaceted approach. By way of example, for a new startup, an emerging disruptor, one of the very first things they need to do is they need to figure out what's their legal entity structure. What do they look like? And then they might go into a fundraising process. And so through other services, we might be able to help them structure what it means to go through the fundraising process with the venture capitalists or other fundraising mechanisms. We would provide advice and structure around their tax protocols, indirect and direct tax. As soon as they come up with that thing, whatever that digital thing is does that thing cross geographical boundaries? Does it cross state, federal, or other global types of boundaries? And there are tax implications associated with that. Unfortunately, some of the young entrepreneurs, they look at building the technology, they build the solution, and they forget about the business protocol. Also, as mentioned earlier, we do a lot of risk management with them, which is around the compliance-related matters, the AML and the KYC. It's absolutely essential that whether you're a startup or you're an existing enterprise, big or small, that you're totally buttoned up around compliance, regulatory, and AML, KYC matters. We're doing work across the globe around the audit function. So auditing companies that are either enterprise scale or smaller around how do you audit a digital transaction, and what does that mean to digitize an asset, and what's the tax reporting on cryptocurrency, whether you're a family office or you're a large enterprise. How do you actually report tax against something where there's very, very little regulation and very, very little case history associated with how you do that? And so we provide insight on that. Of course, one of the biggest things that we do is we consult on not only the strategy, but we also provide services associated with the actual technology and the development of the technology across the enterprise. The most important thing we do is we bring a lot of insight associated with industries. What is the white space? What are the gaps? And how do we not only address the opportunity within an industry, but how do we address, as I mentioned earlier, is being able to bring a horizontal view of vertical industries together where they're all part of the same value chain, like the example of the affordability of drugs.
Awesome. Chris, I'm going to turn to you here. Will the blockchain group contribute to Deloitte growth in Denver?
I believe so. I think, when we've talked about some of our growth in the past, from what I think maybe July of last year, we've added 250 folks. In the last time since I was here, we've added 100 folks, some of which are blockchain. But the real key to that is when we have a leader who's located in a geography that's in a specific place. I mean, for us, it makes the case for having more people around a person like Linda that are in her practice make more sense. So we're clearly going to continue to grow. My sincere hope is that, some of that growth will be fueled around blockchain and the folks that work with Linda. But lots of good things going on, and I don't see it changing anytime soon. So.
Awesome. I love to hear growth. I was actually talking to Linda before we got started on the show here about traffic, and as terrible as that is, it means growth for Denver, though,
yes, it does.
Right? Yeah, so I find it exciting. As much as I'm cursing in the car on the way to work, I also am thankful that we are growing here
Indeed.
in Denver. Yes. We have a few minutes here. I want to explore some questions that I know you mentioned on the break here. So
absolutely.
Yeah.
I loved how you framed it, where it's good to know about the technology, but it's actually about the business opportunity with that. And I like looking at where the trends are intersecting in the future. So you had mentioned that you're involved with the World Economic Forum with the Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution, which is fascinating for me. And I wouldn't have necessarily thought that was right up an expert in blockchain technology, but maybe it kind of is, or will be more so in the future. Can you describe a little bit to our audience about what your role is with the World Economic Forum, and what are those issues and opportunities you are seeing with those?
So the viewers can probably go online as well and check out what the World Economic Forum is doing. But as we know, one of their primary charters is really the advancement of technology in general. And so back to the C4IR Council, it is focused on new technologies like IoT, the impact of AI, and it's done in a socially responsible way too. But how do we enable through whether it's white papers that we are writing right now around interoperability, is providing better on-ramps so that companies aren't all needing to innovate around the same topic, and how can they learn from that? So it's a tremendous opportunity to participate and to lead what is their blockchain council, working together with the World Economic Forum, but it's bringing these things to life through frameworks, through the examination of things like interoperability, the security layers, what does cybersecurity mean on such a thing like blockchain platforms, so that everyone benefits from across the entirety of the ecosystem, as I said, rather than each individual trying to invent themselves.
Excellent. And that leads into the next question I had, which I'm impressed with how fast frameworks and rules are coming together. There was nothing there just a few short years ago, when a lot of these blockchain applications seem like they'd have more utility when multiple players are all getting involved. Several different companies, different regulatory agencies, customers, investors can all be on the same thing, rather than one company instituting something that could be a database, but now with standards, it can be something much more. With that role with World Economic Forum or the Deloitte consulting you've seen, are you encouraged by the development of these frameworks, and are these going in the right direction, that we're going to see some rules and standards happen pretty soon?
Yeah, surely. In fact, again, I continue to reference back because it's such a good analogy and a parallel, is when we look at file transfer protocols during the internet era, there were multiple standards early on. Again, blockchain is relatively new. We are seeing the settling of certain standards. Of course, it's an inherently open system. So it's open source, which is in and of itself beneficial. But it's settling itself into fewer protocols, better platforms, and as we get more production use cases out there, as you heard me say earlier, Deloitte measures this through the lens of adoption. And so what does it mean to get broad adoption? You don't do blockchain to yourself. It's actually a multi-party type of orchestration and exchange of information. And so once things go into production, we learn more. And while there's a lot of known unknowns, there's still more unknowns to be had. And what we like to also say is the only thing worse than the wrong answer to the right question is the right answer to the wrong question. And we see this happening in the marketplace. Again, that heavy focus on technology. Shouldn't we be thinking about what are the capabilities that blockchain would allow us to basically disrupt the industry or to simplify a process where I have multiple writers of the same data, where I have huge inefficiency in the marketplace. And so there's a whole series of questions that we exercise with executive teams through our process of labification, so that we're actually focused on the right kernel to start with, as opposed to starting with building something.
Awesome. I want to take these last few minutes that we have here and turn tables a little bit and talk about what Deloitte has planned for the future, near and far. What are we looking at? I know that we talked a little bit about, on the break here, a debrief on June 6th. If you don't mind talking a little bit about that, and then overall,
Sure.
What's going on with Deloitte in Denver?
Sure. I'll let you start with the debrief around blockchain.
Sure. As part of the CPE credits in the profession, in the audit and tax profession, Deloitte hosts a whole series of seminars called debriefs, and that's a capital D with a capital BREIF. So the debrief session on June the 6th will be unfolding some of the insights in a deeper and richer way on our 2019 global survey for blockchain, and we'll bring that to life for us.
Yeah. No, that was quick. I thought I had more time to think about the second part of the question. But I think as a firm, we still are deeply committed to solving complex problems of our clients. I mean, at the core of what we do, that's the thing that we're most interested in. And so, having the 4 unique business lines allow us, this kind of multifunctional view from, Deloitte out to do that. And so, a lot of focus on industry as a firm, as a way to kind of identify and help solve those problems. Lots of folks that are kind of deeply rooted in industries to help figure out those things. And then locally, I really try and, carry on that, Deloitte theme locally. And, there's certain industries that are a lot bigger and more prevalent in Denver. And so I've really put a big emphasis in my, first year and a half in my role on kind of focusing on those industries. So, oil and gas and the high-tech technology industry, and CPG food, and we've got a whole lot of restaurant chains that have started here, smaller and larger. And so we're really doing a lot of kind of industry forums and roundtables around what are the specific topics and what are the specific challenges in those industries, and having a point of view and bringing people in those industries together so that they can network, which I found is the most powerful thing. When you get a room full of, folks that are starting and are running, restaurant entities, and they can talk about some of the challenges and where they're going, that's a powerful thing for them. So I think you'll see a lot of that from us. Cybersecurity has continued to be a really hot topic around the country, the world, and so, we, Denver, have a good group of folks that are leading and doing a lot of wonderful things in that area. I think we're doing some interesting stuff with the federal government down in Colorado Springs. We're doing some great stuff with the state of Colorado and New Mexico and Wyoming around some of their biggest challenges and problems. So really, it's that continued focus on solving complex problems. So,
Yes. Which, as I said before, you guys do a wonderful job of. And I'm going to do a little self-promotion here for you, Chris. One of my favorite things, I follow you on LinkedIn, and you always have such fascinating articles, and you can find those at Deloitte.com as well. But yeah, you always pick such great articles to promote that Deloitte has written about.
Well, I appreciate that.
Yeah, so I'm going to ask people to follow you on LinkedIn.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you all so much. This was a fascinating conversation. I learned a lot here today. I believe you learned some.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I always learn something when I hear Linda talk. So.
See? Awesome. I love hearing that. Again, visit Deloitte.com. You can take that survey. You can find more in the description below. We have a blog post that has all of the information that you guys shared with us here today. Thank you all so much. It has been a pleasure. Be sure to like and subscribe our YouTube page while you're here. Visit cobrt.com/radio-podcast. Type in Chris Schmidt, type in Deloitte. You can find all of the shows that we've done with you, the whole 2. We plan on doing more. So be sure to do that. Also, be sure to get involved in blockchain. Do some research. See where that takes you in the world of blockchain. Thank you all so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.